Well, today we focus on a really sad chapter in the history of God's people. Last week we talked about David being anointed king and how he moved the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem and effectively made it God the center of the people and their lives and their worship. Well, David ruled over a united kingdom, in other words, all 12 tribes of Israel. And the kingdom expanded under his leadership, and it was really the high point of Israel's history. After David, Solomon ruled, his son, and again, it was still a united kingdom. And Solomon was known for his wisdom, and the kingdom continued to expand under Solomon's rule. And Solomon also built the temple, the house for God. But Solomon was brutal, and he was hard on his people. And all of the successes came at the expense of his people. There's this passage in 1 Kings chapter 5 that really gives us a glimpse of Solomon's brutality. Let me read that for you. King Solomon conscripted forced labor out of all Israel. The levy numbered 30,000 men. He sent them to the Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in the Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon also had 70,000 laborers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hill country, besides Solomon's 3,300 supervisors who were over the work, having charge of the people who did the work. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. Think of that. 30,000 forced laborers, and then 150,000 gathering and cutting stones for the temple. So when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam succeeded him, and the people were hoping for a break from the brutality of Solomon and the forced labor, and they wonder if Rehoboam is going to follow in his father's footsteps or if he's going to be different. That's where we are with the reading for this morning. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you." He said to them, "Go away for 3 days, then come again to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, "How do you advise me to answer this people?" They answered him, "If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." But he disregarded the advice of the older men gave him and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him. He said to them, "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him said to him, "Thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us.' Thus you should say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now therefore my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.'" So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king had said, "Come to me again the 3rd day." The king answered the people harshly. He disregarded the advice that the older men had given him and spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah and the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David. So Israel went away from their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah. As I said, this is really a sad part of the history of God's people. Instead of listening to the older, wiser advisors, Rehoboam listened to the young, power-hungry advisors who were driven by ego and career building and personal ambition. And as a result, the kingdom was divided into two. The 10 northern tribes as Israel, with Jeroboam as their king, and then the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, as Judah, and Rehoboam as king. The problem, though, for the northern kingdom was God had said that Jerusalem was the one place to worship and offer sacrifices, and it was located in the southern kingdom. Because of that, Jeroboam then set up places to worship and sacrifice in Bethel and in Dan in the northern kingdom, and that's where the problems began. Here's the rest of the reading. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. He went out from there and built Penuel. Then Jeroboam said to himself, "Now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, the heart of this people will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah." So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." He set one at Bethel, and the other he put at Dan. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Any of that sound familiar to you at all? Have you heard those words before? Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Do you remember when the people of Israel had escaped from Egypt? They journeyed through the Red Sea on dry land, and then they came to Mount Sinai. God summoned Moses up onto the mountain, and there God gave Moses the law. But when Moses didn't come back right away, and he was delayed up there for a while, the people went to Aaron and demanded that Aaron make gods for us. So the people gave Aaron all of their gold jewelry, and he melted it down and cast an image of a calf, and he gave it to the people, and he said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." I mean, the exact same thing, the exact same words, and God's anger burned hotly against the people of Israel. And here we have it again. I mean, you got to wonder, how dumb can you get? I mean, it's one thing to make that mistake one time, but then another thing to make it again a second time. And you think that Rehoboam and the people, or Jeroboam and the people of Israel would have learned their lesson, that they would have some smarts. You don't make golden calves and worship them because they're not God. They didn't deliver you from slavery. They didn't bring them through the wilderness to the promised land. They didn't sustain them on the journey. They didn't deliver them from enemies. They don't have any power. It's just simply cast metal, cast gold, an object with no power. It's the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. You wonder, how could they be so dumb? But Jeroboam did it all out of fear so that he wouldn't lose power and so that he would remain king, just as Rehoboam made his decisions out of fear so that he could keep power. Well, this is Reformation Sunday, as I said with the kids this morning. It's the day that we celebrate Martin Luther and the reforms that he made and how he changed the church and the power structures of his day. And when I first read the reading for today, I wondered, how in the world does this fit with Reformation and Reformation Sunday? But as I thought about it, I realized that there is really a significant parallel there. You see, the reading is all about power and leadership. and resorting to brutal and oppressive tactics to keep power. And when I thought about the Reformation, I realized that it was the same thing. The church of Martin Luther's day was a worldly and political power that resorted to selling forgiveness in the form of indulgences. Where, as I said with the kids, you could buy God's forgiveness and your way out of purgatory and punishment and really for yourself or dead relatives or anyone, and the money went to simply fund St. Peter's in Rome, the building of it. And it was basically extracting money from the poor, lording it over the poor and the uneducated, and resorting to intimidation and domination and oppression in much the same way that Rehoboam did, all to keep power. And that's a far cry from Jesus' understanding of leadership. Do y'all remember Jesus' disciples talking about who was the greatest? And do you remember what Jesus said to them? Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And do you remember what Jesus did according to the Gospel of John on the night that he was arrested? He tied a towel around his waist, bent down, washed his disciples' feet, and called the disciples to be servants and to wash other people's feet. See, today's reading and Reformation Sunday get us thinking about power and leadership and service. We follow Jesus, a leader who's about grace and mercy. A leader who exercised power not by intimidation and domination and oppression, but by washing feet and by giving up his life on a cross. We worship a God who is about serving the vulnerable and who cares for the poor and the oppressed and those in need, and a God who is about easing the burden of the oppressed. That's really the heart of the biblical message and the heart of Jesus' ministry. You and I have been recipients of that love and that grace and forgiveness. We've received it over and over and over again, grace upon grace, day in and day out, every day of our lives. And now we're called to share that same love and grace and forgiveness and to exercise the same care for the poor and the oppressed and those in need. That's why we all give our hard-earned money to support ministries of the congregation like Food Movers and Tight Knit and Kids Hope, which you're going to hear a bit more later, and all the shawls are part of that Tight Knit ministry. That's why you give your hard-earned money to support ministries like Michigan Refugee Hope or the transitional foster care classroom that we're going to be having at church here in a couple of weeks for immigrant children, or our Sunday school ministries or our confirmation ministries. These are all ministries that either care for the vulnerable and needy, or they teach us the faith and the values that lead to caring for the vulnerable and the needy. Over the next few Sundays with the narrative lectionary, we're going to be hearing stories of the people of Israel as they struggle with servant leadership and as they struggle to live out the values of caring for the poor and the vulnerable and the oppressed, and as they struggle with serving false gods. And over again in those stories, we'll hear how they fell into the trap of worshiping false gods and neglecting the poor and the vulnerable and the oppressed, and how the prophets called them back to God, and how God agonized over God's wayward people. But the story that will run in and through and under the people's struggle is the story of God's love and grace, and how despite the people's lack of forgiveness or lack of faithfulness, God always remained faithful to them. And that is the same story of Luther and the Reformation brought to light, and the same story that runs through our lives. Amen.